Nehemiah has always been a model for leadership. Nehemiah has always been a model for leadership. We're going to see it actually in a couple of ways for us this morning, but just thinking about the fact of Old Testament history, Nehemiah is getting us right down to the very end of it, almost down to the end where we would have Malachi and we go into the 400 years of silence. But Nehemiah, great example of leadership. So let's kind of look at what's taking place in the book. First of all, in the first 4 verses, there is consideration. And why is there consideration? What's consideration mean? What's consideration mean? Yeah, thoughts for the needs of people. So you get to Nehemiah chapter 1, you look in those first 4 verses, what does Nehemiah see that they need to have? What do they need? In verse 3, they're in great distress and reproach. Because why? Wall is broken down. We talked about this last week. Why was the wall so important? That's how you had to have your protection. And when you've got a physical problem like this, you have to do what? You have to work to correct it. And the problem is there's just no simple way to correct it. The only way to correct it is to actually what? Is to actually go out and do it. And that's a really, really hard part. When you get injured, as you get older and you get injured, you go in and you have a procedure and you think all is well. But then what do you have to go through? Recovery, which is also called what? Rehab. Another word for rehab is physical therapy. I don't think and remember, as a preacher, being here for all of these years and hearing all of these people and visiting all of these people who've been through rehab or physical therapy, I cannot think of a single instance where someone says, I love rehab. I can't wait to go to physical therapy. I don't think I've met a single person who's told me that. Why is that? Because it's a lot of what? It's a lot of work. And the one dastardly fact that you learn in physical therapy, in rehab, is you think, okay, fine, Medicare, 21 days. I can do anything for 21 days. And what's the first thing they tell you in rehab? You're going to have to do this every day. For how long? For the rest of your life. For the rest of your life. The 21 days of Medicare only opens the door to the fact that whatever is wrong with you, it's going to take you the rest of your life to cope with it and live with it. And honestly, there's not a lot of people who can what? Who can deal with that and who can handle that. The only way to fix something is, unfortunately, to just go out and fix it. And this was the problem that Nehemiah was up against. It had to be fixed. And we see Nehemiah reacting to it. So let's kind of talk about the reaction before we get on a little bit further into these first 4 chapters. Nehemiah's reaction, which begins in verse 5, was what? He said he sat down and he wept and he mourned many days. And he fasted and he prayed. And then we have in verse 5 what? We have the prayer. We have the prayer. I told you that Nehemiah is looked at as a model of leadership. But he's also a model of what? Of prayer. He's also a model of prayer. So, why did prayer help Nehemiah? How was Nehemiah going to fix the problem? Think about this on its base level. How was Nehemiah going to fix this problem? Yes, had to get there. Lots of complications to it. Once he's there, we'll talk about what happens to that in the second chapter. Once he's there and everything's sorted out, how do you fix the problem? He's got to do that. And we're coming back to that. The way to fix a physical problem, as Nehemiah stood there, he had to put one brick on top of another. That's how the problem was going to get fixed. You got to put one brick on top of the other. And you got to do that a million times. And that actually that's actually part of one of the nice things about our problem solving. Sometimes our problem solving, some of it, I was kind of alluding to this in the lesson, sometimes fixing our problems are very, very simple. You just have to repeat it a million times. Sometimes they're very, very complex that you only have to do once or twice. So again, it just depends on what your problem is. Nehemiah's problem to fix it was very, very easy. But why pray? Why pray? That wasn't going to put one brick on top of the other. Why pray? He wanted God to be with him. Because what did God being with him bring to the problem? What did God being with him bring to the problem? Okay, security from everything around him, one thing. Charles, what did you say? It's going to ultimately bring him success. It's going to bring him, and I say this relatively speaking, maybe it wasn't, but as we get just a little bit further into the book, was Nehemiah able to do it without any issues? No. Now, how serious those issues were, it's hard to know without actually being there, but we know that he wasn't able to do it without problems. What did God being with him bring to the table? What did it bring to building the wall? It helped. It gave Nehemiah what? It gave him confidence. It gave him hope. It gave him purpose to be able to complete it. So in your life, where fixing your problem is one brick on top of another, what does God bring to the problem? He brings the idea to do it, the contentment to do it. He brings the hope to do it. He brings the purpose to get it done. He can even unlock the door for what? The wisdom to get it done. But it's up to you to actually do it. It's up to you to actually do it. And sometimes it's like the rehab. There's 5 things that have to be done every day for the rest of your life. And it's very, very tiring. It's very, very difficult. But the people who can stick with it and do it turn out to manage their problems okay, as best as could be. I'll say that. But Nehemiah begins with prayer. He begins to focus the fact on God being the ultimate success to everything that he's trying to do. And he begins, and it's actually a wonderful prayer in verse 6. He says, "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned." He's going to come back to this. Actually, Nehemiah chapter 1 is not the significant prayer that most people think about. That comes in chapter 9. But already what's Nehemiah doing? And chapter 9 honestly is just kind of a larger version of what we just read in verse 6. What does he do in verse 6? He's doing what in verse 6? Coming to God and telling Him what? That he has sinned, that the people have sinned, and that the people need, if they've sinned, what do they need? They need repentance, they need forgiveness, and they need to understand that in order to complete this, they have to have God behind everything that He's doing. So in verse 11, Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of man, for I was the king's cupbearer. Nehemiah, just like Denise had said, the solution is going to be putting one brick on top of the other, but he did have to get there. So in chapter 2, how was he going to have to get there? As we move on to preparation, how does he get there? Chapter 2, looking in verse 5. He goes in before the king, which actually is a great lesson in and of itself. In verse 4, he goes in before the king because he is the cupbearer. He goes in before the king, and what does the king notice? That there's something what? There's something odd. There's something not normal. So in chapter 2, verse 4, what does Nehemiah do? The king said, what do you request? So I what? Prayed to the God of heaven. There are all of the written prayers. I mean, we've got chapter 1, we just kind of skimmed it. When we get to chapter 9, if we get to read all of it, if you look at the prayers, for example, of maybe you think the most beautiful prayer is the prayer of Jesus in John 17. Maybe you go back to the prayer of Solomon when the temple was dedicated. Maybe 1 Kings chapter 7. And all of these are just glorious, beautiful, beautiful prayers. You go back to the Psalms like was mentioned in the lesson, and you read those. Those are written prayers, and they're all very beautiful. In chapter 2, verse 4, is one of the wisest little bits of advice that we could ever have. And we don't even know the words that Nehemiah said. Why is it so wise for us? And in that moment, he what? In that moment, he prayed. So maybe there comes time to have a big conversation with your husband or wife, an important one, the kind of, we need to talk, the preface of we need to talk, because usually that signals what? It's important. And maybe before conversations like that, you need to what? You need to pray. It may not be something that's openly noticeable or visible, but you need to pray. There may be times when you have really difficult conversations with your children. And we had them. Every parent knows how difficult some conversations can be. We try to teach them, and we try to show them how to interact with the world by doing that. We can be the fun-loving parents and the loving parents. We should be. But there comes time, and hopefully there's not many of them, but there do come times when it's got to be really, really serious about something. So before that, what do you need to do? You need to pray. And maybe before a conversation with a member of the church, or maybe before a conversation with someone that you work with, or maybe someone who works for you, and there's a lot at stake. What do you need to do? What do you need? You need to pray. Nehemiah is a model of leadership, not only because he could get one brick put on top of the other, not only could he come in what seems to be pretty good time. Do you guys remember how long it took him? We won't spoil it. It doesn't take long, or it doesn't seem like it takes long. Did he come in under budget? I don't have any idea. But part of being a leader was also being a man of what? A man of prayer. A man of a God. And a woman of God. This was all important in it. So, in chapter 2, beginning in verse 5, what does he have to do? He prays, but why does he pray? He's got to ask for what? Permission from the king. He's at, what would we call it today? What's he asking for? A leave of absence. He's asking for, if you're in the university crowd, he's asking for a what? A sabbatical, a leave of absence. And you could imagine that the king could have become furious at him, but the king allows him. So what does he do? He goes back and he takes with him several hundred people. This is significantly less than Ezra took back, and way, way, way less than Joshua and Zerubbabel took back. But he still takes with him several hundred people, about 600 or 700 people with him. He goes back to Jerusalem, and what does he do? He does rebuild it, but before he rebuilds it, what has he got to do? He's got to survey it. So in verse 11, he starts going out and he looks at it. And I don't want you to think that when you look at the walls of Jerusalem now, so Jerusalem is a city that's basically broken into effectively 4 quarters. But what the walls that Nehemiah were talking about would not be the kind of walls like in the days of, even in first century days. These would have been more like walls around the city of David. So we're not talking about a circumference that would equal miles and miles. It would be a much more manageable project. But even when he goes out and he starts to survey it, starting in chapter 2, verse 11, what does he find? What does he find as he starts going out in chapter? It's kind of like a catalog. What does he go out and he sees? What does he find? It was in pretty what? It was in pretty bad shape. Pretty bad shape. In verse 17, as we get to the motivation, then I said to them, you see the distress that we're in, how Jerusalem, what? Lies waste. How the gates are burned with fire. So come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a what? Reproach. Let us rise up and build. He knew that it was going to be a rough situation because, again, it was, as he had surveyed, a pretty widespread destruction, which that's exactly what they got. In verse 18, though, what does he add? What does he add? Yes. And how does he say it? How does he say it? The hand of my God. Now, where did we notice the hand of my God first? Where did we notice that first? Do you remember where? It was first in Ezra. And the hand of my God seems to be an expression that comes on late in the Jewish writing. Where the expression comes from or how the expression kind of came to be, I've never been able to find out. But the idea of the good hand of the Lord on me or the hand of God with me was not all the way through Jewish history. It only comes on here more at the end. But what does it mean? What does it signal as Nehemiah is trying to rally these people and get them to help? What does it signal to these people? that he'd been approved by God. And that God, in trying to get this project done, to try to get it completed, God was what? Right there with them. So the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also of the king's words that he had spoken to me, and they said, let us rise up and build. Then they what? Set their hands to the good work. Now, in verse 19, of course, what took place? Opposition. Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem, the Arab, heard of it. They laughed at us and they despised us, saying, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? So I answered them and said, the God of heaven himself will what? Prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but you have no heritage or no right or memorial in Jerusalem. So he rallies the people. He starts to face the opposition. Now the opposition is going to get worse, but he begins to face the opposition. And we get into chapter 3. So in chapter 3, what does he do? In chapter 3, what does he do? Remember, the theme is, let us rise up and build. So in chapter 3, the people what? They rose up. And they did what? They worked. They built. And so in chapter 3, I mean, essentially what you have is an explanation of how the people worked together. And how did they work together? Okay, so how did they work together? So they could trade off in their work. One could do the work while the other stood guard. And can only presume, but it is just a presumption, that they could switch those roles while one guarded, the other one could build. But all the way around through the wall, people were all what? They were all involved in it. Now, maybe some of the people who guarded weren't people who were particularly skilled at building. I mean, it's probably easier, I guess, with pre-made bricks because they're all what? They're all the same size and they're all the same shape. And the mortar is pretty much down to a nice little formula, and it all comes out very, very similarly. Back then, it probably wasn't the case. So you're having to work with it. You're having to cut it. You're having to fix it. You're having to set. Maybe not all of the people could do that. But you did have people who could assist in that work and to help them and to guard them while they were doing it. If you notice, even in chapter 3 and verse 12, what does chapter 3 and verse 12 say? And not only did you not have everyone dealing with the brickwork, but some people you had to have to do the what? You had to have them to work on and construct and then hang the gates. So Proverbs chapter 3 verse 12, what does it say? Okay, so even all of them, even all of the family had made these repairs. So chapter 3 ends up being a nice summation of how all of them had done these repairs. But before we kind of get to the end of how the repairs come, there's chapter 4. And what happens in chapter 4? One. Okay, the enemies came. So who comes up first in chapter 4? Sanballat. Heard that we were rebuilding the wall. Furious, very indignant, mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? So again, all these different kinds of problems that they had to respond to them. Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build, even what? Even if the fox goes up on it, he'll what? He'll fall, he'll break it down. How big's a fox? It looks like a big what? Cat. Yeah, a fox looks like a big cat. Probably, I'm assuming, weighs about the same, roughly the same amount. So even if a fox jumps up on it, it's going to knock it down. But again, in verse 4, Nehemiah, hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their heads. Give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity. Do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have revoked you to anger before the builders. So in verse 6, we did what? We built it, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had what? A people had a mind to work. You know, again, we talked about this last week, that attitude always has to be there before what? Yeah, attitude always has to precede action. They were able to build this wall to half its height because why? Because the people had a mind to work. Now, the easy part is, and we'll just go ahead and bring this up, is how fast they could build the wall. So how fast could they build that wall? Has anyone found it out yet? How many days it took them? 52 days. 52 days. A project that lasted 52 days. So you've got a congregation, and ultimately we're going to work toward, no pun intended, we're going to work toward talking about us rising up and building. We are laborers in the kingdom of God, and we work to build up a congregation. So how long does a congregation last? And I mean, and we can be frank with one another. No congregation lasts what? Forever. So how long does a congregation last? Do what now? Yeah, depends a lot on the workers. Sometimes they only last what? A few years. Sometimes they only last a few years and they're gone. Some congregations can last how long? Long, long time. Jenny grew up in Nashville, Indiana. That's really the name of it. Nashville, Indiana. It has, as far as its residents are concerned, maybe 3,000. It's a tourist town because it was built around or built close to, or I guess I should say the town was built, and then they put a state park right there by it, and it's one of the nicest state parks in Indiana. And the congregation that she goes to, that she grew up in, is out in the country, and it has a placard inside of it that it was founded in 1887, and they still meet. So that's 140 years. Do you know how unbelievably rare that is? How unbelievably rare that is. Most of the time, churches only last a few decades. So we're going to talk next time about getting into the work and what can help a church be a light for as long as possible.